USC wide receiver Drake London is a former basketball star turned bully of a receiver on the college football gridiron. And his production in his final season at USC opened every scout and draft enthusiast's eyes. In just 8 games, less than half of an NFL season, London put up an astronomical 88 receptions on 119 targets for 1,084 yards and 7 touchdowns. That's 11 catches per game and over 100 yards per game as well. This performance has rightfully brought London all the way up to the top of draft boards, sometimes mocked in the top 10 of the draft, and created the debate of if he is the best wide receiver in the 2021 draft. Now, I understand the hype. London is a uniquely impressive player who wins in a lot of ways that you typically can't find in a wide receiver. And I'm going to highlight what those unique strengths are, but London also has one huge, defining weakness, and that is a severe lack of speed. And this brings up some pretty bad PTSD. Reminding me of other comparable prospects such as N'Keal Harry, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, who I was much lower on than consensus, and held them as huge reaches by the Patriots and the Eagles. And it also reminds me of some other lesser-known players that I did like. Guys that came out with similar molds like Kelvin Harmon out of NC State, Isaiah Hodgins out of Oregon State, who I hyped up as sleepers in their respective draft class because, sure, they weren't fast, but they had quick feet, good route running, and exceptional ball skills. Which brings me back to Drake London. Now, I want to clarify here, there are areas of the field that Drake London will not just win at, but potentially dominate at. And that is what makes him so exciting. For a 6'4", 220-pound receiver, he's not a complete tree like an Allen Lazard or something. No, London has rare foot speed. He's got rare stop-start ability for such a big receiver. And this allows him to cut quickly at the top of his routes and stop on a dime to create separation. So when London is asked to run routes like 10 or 15-yard out routes or hitch routes, he's able to cut very quickly and create separation at the top of that route. He also uses his foot speed as a ball carrier, where I was really pleasantly surprised by his acceleration after the catch and his quickness and agility to make defenders miss and create tough yardage. London also wins in a more obvious way that stares you in the face anytime you load up a Drake London highlight reel, and that is with genuinely elite hands and ball-winning ability. He brings that former basketball background to the table and has a big wingspan, so when the ball is in the air, he treats it like a rebound floating up in the air and he attacks the ball with the best of them. He also has an understanding of something many receivers actually struggle with, and that is knowing the value of working backwards to the football when it's in the air, when you're under the DB. We talk so much about needing speed and route running to create separation, and I certainly do just as much as anyone, but there's no lie, there are other ways to create subtle separation, and working back to the football is one of them. So when the ball is in the air, if you work your way back, you're going to force the defensive back to cover more ground. You're going to increase the distance he needs to cover to get to you when you make the catch. Now, the reason many receivers fail at this is because it does require a bigger catch radius. By working backwards from where the quarterback was initially targeting you, the receiver needs to either jump up and attack the ball or extend his arms up and away from his body to go get the football. And London has that catch radius to do this, and he knows how to do it and use that to his best advantage in a very impressive way. So even though London doesn't have great speed, he does have these unique abilities that help him win in unique ways. So you may be wondering what the concern is. How can London be a potential bust if he was so productive and he's so good at these things? Well, the problem is that these abilities are much harder to unlock in the NFL, and they require good quarterback play as well as creative scheming and play calling. I'll explain that a little further in a minute. What I mean by that is London isn't like most of these other receivers who are going to be drafted in the first or second round, because drafting him isn't as simple as a guy like Olave, Jahan Dotson, Garrett Wilson, for example, and that those guys have good route running and speed at all three levels, so you can simply plug them into really any scheme, any play call, and expect them to be able to run the full route tree and create separation, which is ultimately what is king at wide receiver in the NFL. And what this means is that a smart NFL team will press the living daylights out of Drake London, just as a smart defense like Colorado did at USC, where he did struggle to create some separation. They're gonna force London to win on the outside by either stacking the corner, which, as we mentioned, he's gonna really struggle to do without that speed, or by connecting on very high difficulty back shoulder balls that require chemistry with a good, smart, accurate quarterback. So when a defense presses London, he can't use that quick route running that we mentioned before to whip open on hitch routes and out routes like he can when defenses play off coverage against him. And I do believe that NFL teams will be far from afraid to press Drake London and force him to win deep and on these comebacks. Now, it is worth noting that it's a good time for London to enter the NFL, because right now NFL schemes are going more and more towards off-man, quarters-heavy coverages that are going to open up some of that underneath space for a Drake London. So that is a slight note in his benefit, but that doesn't mean that there aren't tons of teams, if not still a majority of NFL teams, who are not afraid to press on the outside, and definitely won't be with Drake London. So for Drake London, as I mentioned, his ability to survive on the outside as a wide receiver in the NFL is going to be almost entirely dependent on him landing with a team that has a quarterback who is smart and accurate and willing to work with London to establish these back shoulder throws. And it's not just that, he also needs to go to a team that has the awareness to build these back shoulders into the offense instead of just asking him to run 9 routes or deep crossers from the outside, which I just don't project him to be able to do in the NFL and create separation. So when I say Drake London is a boom or bust prospect, it's not that we don't know what he can do or that he doesn't have great strengths, but he's going to need quarterback play and the right coordinator to understand how he can win on the outside in the NFL. So if he doesn't land in the right spot, that's where he can end up a bust, just like we see so many times. Now, developing an elite back shoulder game isn't the only way that London can work out in the NFL. There is another way that London can be used at the next level that should work very well, but again, it would require the right team and scheme fit, and that is using London as a big slot type of wide receiver, comparable to the way the Saints use Michael Thomas, who actually isn't a bad high-end comparison for Drake London, by the way. But if London can't threaten deep without a quarterback who can hit those back shoulder comebacks and keep corners honest over the top, like I said, he's not going to be able to win consistently on the perimeter in the NFL. So what do you do with him then? Well, you can move him into the slot if you're seeing a lot of press coverage. And I firmly believe that he's got that rare foot speed, the size, and he's a great run blocker, which are all traits that should really seamlessly translate into the slot for London. And there's really 3 reasons why London can be a dominant impact from the slot if used creatively. Number 1 is that it's harder to manufacture that press coverage from the slot. You can line up London more disguised off the line of scrimmage by putting him in bunch formations, using pre-snap motion, among other ways that offensive coordinators can use to get creative to create space for a wide receiver before the ball is even snapped. So in the right scheme with creative play calling, you can avoid some of that inability for him to stack wide receivers on the outside. Number 2 is that slot corners tend to be much smaller, so this will give London a one-on-one advantage, both in his ability to beat any press coverage he sees, because he's gonna be much bigger, he's gonna have that massive frame to throw these smaller slot corners to the side, but it also is going to help him win contested balls at an even higher clip if he's getting matched up with smaller corners. So with this, we're not just talking about winning on slants or whip routes or skinny posts. you can draw up real vertical concepts to get him down the field against these smaller corners if you're creative. So you can get him going on deep posts, seam routes, wheel routes, and lots of options that would let London use those great ball skills vertically down the field and open up his upside a little bit more, even though he's not a burner. But again, this will require a creative play caller that can mix this into the offense and use him correctly. And the third way that London could be really used effectively from the slot is he's really good with the ball in his hands. He's got those quick feet. He accelerates quickly. He's got long arms to do stiff arms, so he can make guys miss and be an effective bubble screen receiver from the slot where it's easier to use receivers on those bubble screens. But he's also a really good blocker as well. He loves bullying these corners, and I'm sure if he gets matched up on 5'9", 5'10" NFL slot corners, he'd like it even more. So you can use him as a blocker to create space for other electric ball carriers as well. So in summary, if you want to put Drake London on the outside in the NFL, when defenses play off coverage against him, I have no doubt in my mind that he's going to be able to win on the outside, to operate efficiently underneath with those sharp routes and ability to work back to the football, just as we mentioned. But when defenses start pressing him, he will either need a quarterback who is good at throwing back shoulders to keep those cornerbacks honest while defending go balls, or he's going to need to move inside to a big slot role where his skill set has great potential, but it is going to be a much more complex position that's going to require an adept offensive coordinator who can use him in those creative ways I earlier described. Ultimately, if London is fortunate enough to land with a creative team who can utilize him in these ways, he can be a monster, similar to like a Michael Thomas or maybe a late career Larry Fitzgerald, and avoid being the next N'Keal Harry or JJ Arcega-Whiteside. But just as we've seen time and time again, sometimes NFL teams just aren't smart like this, and they fail to put unique skill sets like London has in the right position to succeed. And that is exactly what might scare me about Drake London, and why his unique tastes make him a boom or bust prospects. So what teams might be smart enough to maximize a Drake London? Well, I'm just going to have to leave you hanging on that one and say make sure you subscribe here on That Franchise Guy for more draft content just around the corner. We'll have a new mock draft coming up later this week, hopefully post-combine, and I'll be sure to discuss some of those potential fits for Drake London when we get there. But until then, I appreciate you for watching. Please do hit that like button to show your support if you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.